The Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and Internal Organizations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. As a reminder to members, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you are not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing on the unfolding conflict in Ethiopia. Today, we are hearing testimony on the conflict in Ethiopia and would like to hear recommendations on what the United States and the international community can do to help stabilize the region and decrease the tensions between the government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. There are several intra-ethnic conflicts regarding politics and social standing in Ethiopia covering decades. This highlights the country's long dispute over group and individual rights and whether centralized government is the way to true democracy for citizens of Ethiopia. During my many visits to Ethiopia, I have expressed to leaders that the government must have representation for all ethnic groups and, most importantly, always protect its citizens. The current state of Ethiopia not only has a ripple effect on its citizens, but neighboring countries such as Somalia, Sudan, and Eritrea are negatively affected. Ethiopia's instability and ethnic strife are producing security repercussions in Somalia. African Union forces depend heavily on Ethiopian troops to help combat violent extremism in the region. Somalia has upcoming elections that may be tense, and the Trump administration is planning to withdraw U.S. Special Operation Forces from the country soon, which will strengthen al-Shabaab and weaken anti-forces. Recent reporting noted that Tigray forces fired missiles toward the capital of Eritrea after Ethiopian troops pushed them from their regional capital. These actions certainly have political ramifications, but one of my major concerns is that far too often during conflict, innocent civilians are the ones who are killed, injured, or displaced and have to flee across borders. Another regional concern for Sudan, after 30 plus years of authoritarian rule, Sudan, which borders Tigray, is trying to peacefully transition to a democracy and strengthen its economy, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front to have a continued peaceful dialogue with the help of African Union mediation to resolve this issue once and for all. Citizens on all sides of this conflict should have a right to be heard and peacefully protest, and there should be the freedom to disseminate what's going on in the country by journalists. I appreciate and I'm looking forward to hearing from Sedale Lema, who can give a firsthand report on what is happening in the country. The Ethiopian diaspora is also critical in resolving this conflict. My office meets with and hears the concerns of this multi-ethnic community. We have taken meetings with groups representing the Amhara, Oromo, and Tigray and other communities. We have heard from activists, journalists, political actors, and regular citizens who are concerned about their loved ones in the country. I hear you, my office hears you, and Congress hears you. That said, I want you to know that the purpose of this hearing is to explore the deteriorating social and political situation in the country, the recent conflict, while attempting to find ways for the United States to be helpful and hear policy recommendations for how to resolve this conflict. The purpose is not to provide a space for any one ethnic group to lay out their grievances. We understand various ethnic, religious, regional, and political communities have been affected, and we want to acknowledge that. That is the reason why we are holding this hearing. Each witness here will contribute to our understanding of the situation, but you must know also that this is not the only source of our information. You know that the members present at this hearing today care about their constituents who are among the Ethiopian diaspora, recognizing the long-standing bilateral relations with Ethiopia and consider the country an important regional partner, but we must maintain a diplomatic posture and ensure that this hearing does not contribute to tensions back in Ethiopia. You will notice that we will raise your concerns and ask questions that you have raised in meetings or via email or written correspondence. I hope that you trust that we will continue to be champions for human rights in Ethiopia. I recently led the bipartisan resolution 1183 supporting respect for human rights and encouraging continued democratic progress in Ethiopia and condemning the targeted violence and destruction of property directed against ethnic and religious minorities, the excessive use of force by Ethiopian forces against peaceful protesters, the arrest of journalists and peaceful protesters who exercise their constitutional rights, and hate speech and disinformation that fuel ethnic and political violence by groups raised in Ethiopia and in the diaspora. I heard from constituents that the language did not go far enough. We hear you, and we will consider this feedback as we revise and prepare the legislation for the new Congress. I would like to thank our witnesses for participating in this important hearing. We all look forward to hearing your insight into the current situation in the country and recommendations for possible ways forward. When we decide to have a hearing, it is with great consideration, and mainly the push to have this hearing came from the diaspora. Sometimes it's difficult for us, though, to make a decision to have a hearing, because then when we do, people want us to represent one side or the other. And that's not the role for us to play here in Congress. So hopefully you will find this hearing productive, and you will understand that we are committed to the U.S. playing a productive role and assisting Ethiopia find its way to peace and unity. And this hearing is just, and the resolution is just one step forward. It will not be the last. Thank you very much, and I now call on the ranking member for his comments.
Thank you very, very much, Karen, Chairwoman Bass, for convening this very, very important hearing. And as you said, we are listening, and I think it's important that we do it. It's totally bipartisan, and I want to thank you for that. It's been a real joy to work with you as ranking member, and at that point, you were my ranking member. So I think, it just shows it's all about the issues and the concerns. And obviously what's happening in Tigray region is very, very serious. The loss of life has been horrific. And so I think it's very important that we have this hearing today. So thank you very much. Indeed, it is my belief that Ethiopia is one of the most strategically significant countries in all of Africa, Nigeria, in my opinion, being the other one, and there are others that are very important as well. But what happens there is amplified throughout the region. While I am hopeful that the Ethiopian government, since they've captured the regional Tigrayan capital of Mekelle, coupled with the announcement just made that the government will allow United Nations humanitarian assistance to flow into the region under their control, that hopefully that signals an end to armed conflict. But there is a concern, and I know you share it, Chairwoman Bass, that the fall of the capital does not necessarily mark the end of the armed conflict. It could be part of a stage, and we're very worried, all of us, about a protracted civil war characterized by guerrilla tactics. All the more reason why there must be a robust response by everyone. This concern is based in part on the history of the Tigray People Liberation Front, or the TPLF, and the geography of the Tigray region and Ethiopia. The TPLF, as we all know, came to rule all of Ethiopia following a successful guerrilla campaign against the Derg, a case of Marxist-inspired movement overthrowing a Marxist government in the early 1990s. As guerrillas, the TPLF used the highland terrain of Ethiopia, including Tigray, to their advantage. During the years of TPLF rule, the subcommittee was at the forefront of raising concern about human rights abuses. Following a critical hearing that I chaired in the spring of 2005, I traveled to Ethiopia, met with Prime Minister Meles that August, as well as with human rights leaders. I raised concerns directly with him in about a 2-hour meeting, especially the egregiously flawed national election, and the killing of dissidents that was occurring in the streets and the mass arrests. In the next year, I introduced the Ethiopia Freedom, Democracy, and Human Rights Advancement Act, and following the passing of Prime Minister Meles, domination by the TPLF continued, and this subcommittee again held another critical hearing, Ethiopia after Meles and the future of democracy and human rights. And it was a resolution which I introduced along with you, Chairwoman Bass, HRES 128, supporting respect for human rights and encouraging inclusive governance in Ethiopia. It passed the House on April 10th, 2018, and it laid out milestones for transition from rule by the TPLF. Following Prime Minister Abe's ascension, you and I met with him in Addis in August of 2018, and we were encouraged by his words, by his actions, including the release of thousands of political prisoners. The removal of the TPLF, as we all know, as the dominant power in Ethiopia, has brought a reform-minded Prime Minister Abe to leadership in 2008, but it also unleashed protracted jockeying between other ethnic groups, most notably the two largest, the Oromo and the Amhara, as well as intra-ethnic conflict. Indeed, the Prime Minister's position among his own Oromo group is not completely solidified, and his pan-Ethiopian vision is challenged by Oromo separatists, such as the Oromo Liberation Front and now jailed firebrand Jawar Mohammed. These ethnic tensions are further exacerbated by a constitutional order bequeathed by the TPLF, commonly called ethnic federalism, which has led to the pitting of one group against another and fueled regional separatism and the desire to cleanse regions of other ethnicities. Though it may not be considered polite to discuss issues such as ethnicity and religion, one cannot understand the current crisis in Ethiopia without reference to the ethnic tensions which are often overlaid with religious ones. We in the Congress must be careful, however, and I think you pointed to that in your opening statement, Chairwoman Bass, not to inadvertently stir up further ethnicity-based division by taking the side of one group over another, but rather urge a path of reconciliation and negotiation, which will likely lead to no one being fully satisfied, but will help reduce tensions. Many individuals and groups can point to grievances, we know that, and they are well-founded grievances, whether historical or ongoing, and they are real. The war in Tigray threatens to exacerbate an already severe humanitarian problem. We have seen crisis upon crisis beset Ethiopia in this year alone. Not only did COVID-19 impact Ethiopia, as it did so many other countries, including our own, but on top of that, there was a major locust plague, which has created major food insecurity throughout Ethiopia, the Horn, East Africa, and beyond, and now armed conflict. There needs to be a time for justice and accountability for the atrocities committed by all sides, no matter what the exigent circumstances. Civil liberties, which Prime Minister Abiy, to his credit, helped restore in 2018, cannot be curtailed indefinitely. But first, we need to stop the bloodshed and address the humanitarian crisis. And the anti-ethnic violence and hateful rhetoric must end. As Secretary Mike Pompeo related in his call with Prime Minister Abiy on November 30th, there should be a complete end to the fighting and a constructive dialogue to resolve the crisis. He also stressed the need to protect civilians from further harm, including those fleeing the conflict, crossing the border into Sudan, and respect for the human rights of all ethnic groups, including Tigrayans. Fortunately, it looks like an agreement has been reached between the Ethiopian government and the United Nations to allow for unimpeded humanitarian access to areas of Tigray under government control. I hope that at a minimum, the basic needs of those who have been displaced in the fighting, which some estimate to be 1 million people, can now be addressed while political issues remain to be resolved. Ethiopia, as we all know, is a great country, a proud nation whose roots date back thousands of years to the Old Testament. It retained its independence where others didn't. It's the seat of the African Union and a world leader. Its soldiers help keep peace in other countries in conflict. and its cultural and artistic influence is widespread. It is therefore absolutely imperative that Ethiopia not succumb to internal division and ethnic hatred. Ethiopia is far too important, not just for the Ethiopian people, but for the entire Horn and Africa as a whole. It must overcome this year of crisis and crises and return to being an example, an inspiring example to be followed. Again, I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
And let me just thank you once again, because you have always been, for so many decades, such an incredible champion for human rights. And I remember our visit to Ethiopia, and I just hope that we see peace, that the bombing stops, and that also full communication is opened up. I was encouraged that I know that humanitarian relief can go in, but obviously so much more needs to be done. Before I introduce the members, our witnesses, let me just mention that members of Congress, whether on this panel today or not, represent many different Ethiopian communities, many different Ethiopian ethnic groups. And I suspect that some of the members that are here today might, when it gets to their questions, reflect the questions from that perspective. That is one of the ways that we will try to handle the incredible amount of text messages, emails, phone calls that we have received from various sectors of the Ethiopian diaspora. And as Congressmember Smith said, it is really important that we try to maintain a neutral position, as much as various diaspora groups would like for us to take one side or another. It is just not appropriate for us to do that as member of Congress. So now I want to introduce our witnesses, and I will recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made as part of the record. I will first call on witness number one for their testimony, but before, let me read the bio of all of the witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. Yosef Bagwaza, is a senior regional advisor at Freedom House, managing Ethiopia programs. Prior to joining Freedom House, he was Secretary General of Ethiopian Human Rights Council, Ethiopia's foremost human rights organization, most known for monitoring and reporting on human rights violations. After systemic and persistent attacks in response to the Human Rights Council, Mr. Bagwaza fled the country. Once relocated to the United States, he continues to be a leading voice for human rights protection and good governance in Ethiopia through advocacy, policy, and research. In 2010, he won the Human Rights Award for Extraordinary Activism. Our second witness is Ms. Lauren Blanchard, is a specialist in African affairs with the Congressional Research Service, where she provides nonpartisan analysis on African political, military, and diplomatic affairs, and on U.S. policy toward the region to Congress members. Ms. Blanchard's portfolio has focused on East Africa, Chad, and Nigeria, and on security issues and military engagement on the continent. Previously, Ms. Blanchard managed democracy and governance programs in East and Southern Africa. Ms. Seydalai began journalism in 2000 and worked until 2005 with 3 local newspapers, including as a senior reporter at the now defunct but prominent Addis Tribune. From 2005 to 2010, she served at the Ethiopian Embassy in Israel, focusing on communication, regional political affairs, and media. In 2011, Ms. Lema established the Addis Standard monthly magazine, and over the last 10 years has made it one of the most influential magazines in the history of independent media in Ethiopia. Our final witness, Ms. Susan Stignant, is the Director of Africa Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace that last month established an Africa Center to deepen, elevate, and expand the Institute's commitment to stem violent conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. Ms. Stignant oversees the Institute's programming on strategic regional engagement in the Greater Horn of Africa with the African Union, as well as constitutional reform
destruction of livelihoods, and appeared to have returned Ethiopia to yet another protracted civil war nearly 30 years after it emerged from its last. These tragic events have also dealt a deadly blow to what would have been one of the most consequential democratic transitions on the African continent, with significant repercussions for enduring peace and stability on Africa. Hostility between the leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which ruled the Tigray region for nearly 3 decades, and the federal government in Addis Ababa had simmered for 2.5 years prior to the dramatic escalation of tensions on the night of November 3rd. This animosity contributed to deepening rifts among communities and has caused profound damage to the prospect of an inclusive and democratic Pan-African project that could have been an inspiration to millions of across Africa. With a communication blackout in the region since the start of the fighting in November, and the entrenched practice by both parties of using public communication tools to disseminate highly politicized propaganda messages, efforts to identify and independently assess the situation have been difficult. A series of missed opportunities in the last 2.5 years led to the tragic derailment of a promising democratic experiment. A half-hearted effort at implementing reforms by a ruling party establishment reluctant to shed its deeply authoritarian roots stands in the way of a genuine inclusive political process. This is consistent with the core feature of the old EPRDF establishment, which has repeatedly failed to see progress for decades. I now offer a few recommendations on how to get out of this political deadlock and return Ethiopia to a democratic transition. While Ethiopia's political problems have complex historical and cultural roots, many of them can be addressed by adopting a political culture that prioritizes dialogue as a means of managing different views. To support this endeavor and efforts to bring back the Ethiopia back to the democratic transition, the United States should take several steps. One, the United States should urge Ethiopian government and all political actors to engage in broad-based and comprehensive national dialogue to address the core national issues and reach a political settlement ahead of the 2021 national elections. Significant resources have been spent on mainly state-led dialogue initiatives. None of them have succeeded as they followed the same ineffective model of organizing large gatherings without clearly defined set objectives. And agreed upon rules of engagement. For dialogue initiatives to be effective and get political process back to track, they should incorporate several steps. One, dialogue should be preceded by an audit of political actors conducted by independent groups, including civil society. And the dialogue should be inclusive and reject the idea of what many call an elite pact, but should also be preceded by an audit of the political groups. There are 170 political parties in Ethiopia, but very few have active membership. The audit will serve the purpose of determining which ones represent legitimate views and have interests of communities at heart. Number two, dialogue should be guided by rules agreed upon by all parties. Among others, the rules should identify independent facilitators, and sanctions for non-compliance. All parties must renounce the use of violence as a political tool and agree to refrain from inciting supporters to engage in illegal activities. To foster the legitimacy and confidence in the dialogue process, individuals imprisoned because of their political views and journalists and dissidents should be immediately released. Independent civil society, community, and thought leaders should be represented at all levels of the dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to now move on to our next witness, Seydale Lema, the journalist, if she would please speak. And witnesses know that when it comes to the Q&A period, you will have further opportunity to speak. Ms. Seydale?
Thank you, Chairwoman Baz, ranking member Smith, and honorable members of the House Subcommittee. I'm honored to be here to testify about the tragic political trajectory my beloved country, Ethiopia, is confronted with today. The timing for this hearing could not have come at the right moment, provided that the topic to be covered not only deals with the conflict itself, but its complex root cause and recommendations on how to address the crisis in order to help prevent the security situation further deteriorating in Ethiopia and the wider region in the Horn of Africa. The source of the last 30 days military conflict in Tigray is fundamentally political, and as such, inseparable from the cascade of other political crises that rocked Ethiopia for the last 2.5 years, and which have contributed to the astounding number of ethnic, religious, and political violence that continued threatening the country, weakening the state, and causing devastating sufferings to Ethiopians across the country. The conflict in Tigray, although alarming in the immeasurable amount of the suffering it has caused to civilians, especially Tigrayans, it should therefore be not viewed in separate and one-off event. In my view, the conflict is a cumulative result of 3 major political failures. The first one is the ill-timed and unceremonious collapse of the then ruling party, the EPRDF, over which TPLF had a monopoly. The second is the ill-managed opening up of the political space in Ethiopia, which lacked a comprehensive and inclusive political dialogue and political settlement aimed at charting out an agreed upon transitional roadmap. And the third is the advent of COVID-19 pandemic, which induced the postponement of a much anticipated elections in Ethiopia, and how the government handled the postponement of the election. Instead of dealing with it with other political parties and reaching at a settlement, agreed upon settlement, the government has indefinitely postponed the election and caused an agitation of the political space, which has resulted in irreversible crisis that the country continued experiencing. So these political failures were further compounded by political assassinations, the last one of which, the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, being the most consequential that has turned the political landscape from that, which failed to find a negotiated settlement, to that which saw the government as a jailer and its formidable opponents as the jailed. In light of this, I believe 3 things need to happen and need to happen fast. The first one is Ethiopia needs a UN-mandated team to investigate the war on Tigray, the assassinations of senior officials and artist Hachalu Hundessa, as well as the killings of countless civilians and the displacement of millions since Prime Minister Abiy came to office. He has blamed the TPLF for it, which would further create more altercation in the ongoing war. There are repeated recommendations, including one made by Yosef now, for independent and transparent investigations from all corners around the world. But I do believe only a UN-mandated team should be empowered and enabled to commence such task. As a result of a deeply polarized society, no other institution, from Ethiopia's Human Rights Commission to Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch, earns the trust of Ethiopia's polarized society to conduct such important task the same way as a UN-mandated and a politically insulated investigation team should. And her global human rights update delivered at the 45th session of the Human Rights Council on the 14th of September 2020, Michelle Bachelet, the UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, said her office was ready to support a thorough, independent, impartial, and transparent investigation of the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa and subsequent violence that really altered the political landscape in Ethiopia. This offer has not been taken up yet, and I do believe it is time we take Ms. Bachelet's offer and acted on it. What is at stake in post-Tigray's conflict is not the same way what's at stake in post-Hachalu Hundessa's assassination in Ethiopia. Nor can the US afford losing Ethiopia, one of its staunch allies and a force of stability in the Horn and beyond, and wishes to get away with it like it did with Somalia. Ethiopia's political crisis, which is haunting the government of Prime Minister Abiy, needs to find its root causes. A UN-mandated investigation team is the only place to start looking for in order to hold to account those who have wreaked havoc for the last 2.5 years and continue to find a closure. Ethiopia must also commence an all-inclusive political dialogue as soon as possible. And that should be preceded by the release of all political prisoners.
Now, excuse me. Let me move on to the next witness, please. Ms. Blanchard. Is Ms. Blanchard with us?
Can you see me?
No, but keep talking. I think the camera to you.
Okay, sorry, I seem to be having a video problem. Can you hear me though?
We can hear you fine.
Okay.
You just go right ahead.
Okay. Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting CRS to testify today. While the government of Ethiopia announced an end to its military operations last Saturday, the situation in Tigray remains serious, with fighting ongoing and a potential for this to become a protracted insurgency. For context, Tigray has a population roughly equivalent to that of Maryland, around 6 million people. The federal government is now moving to install a provisional regional administration in areas under its control, but it remains to be seen how they will be received. In my testimony today, I'd like to highlight a few key points on the situation for congressional consideration and respectfully request that my written testimony be submitted for the record. First, the communications blackout and access restrictions to Tigray have made it very difficult to confirm information on the conflict and the humanitarian situation there. This allows misinformation to flourish amidst contested and very polarizing narratives. Second, the conflict was not unforeseen. Tensions between Abiy's government and the TPLF had been simmering for months, with saber rattling from both sides. Opportunities to avert this conflict were missed, both by domestic and international actors. Third, the conflict is ongoing, and there are reports of atrocities by militia associated with both sides. Fourth, Tigray is not the only conflict zone in Ethiopia, and a protracted conflict there could undermine the government's ability to respond to unrest and threats to civilians in other parts of the country. And finally, the conflict has implications for US interests, not only in Ethiopia, but the broader region. First, on the information blackout, with phone and internet connections to Tigray down and journalists prevented from accessing most of the region, it's very difficult to know what's happening there. The extent of internal displacement and humanitarian need are still unclear. The press suggests that thousands have been killed, but there are no reliable estimates on the scale of the casualties. Prime Minister Abiy says no civilians were killed in the government's operations, but some refugees are telling a different story. Human rights experts note that it's very difficult to verify responsibility for reported atrocities. Both sides have sought to shape the narrative on the conflict, and there's been a serious rise of hate speech on social media platforms. Journalists, meanwhile, are facing threats and intimidation. Ethiopian journalists are in a particularly difficult position, but foreign correspondents are also under pressure. Federal authorities have issued fact-check statements to disseminate positions and contradict what they characterize as misrepresentations in the international media. And 2 weeks ago, the senior analyst on Ethiopia from the International Crisis Group was expelled from the country, ostensibly over a work permit issue. Second, despite the federal government declaring victory, reports suggest that the fighting continues in parts of Tigray. UN officials and aid agencies have stressed serious concerns about the current humanitarian situation inside the region and the need for urgent access, particularly to the Eritrean refugee camps inside Tigray, where over 96,000 Eritrean refugees are located. An agreement reached this week between the UN and the federal government is an important development, but it isn't yet clear how civilians in areas beyond federal control will be reached. Civilians have been caught in the middle of this conflict. Refugees who have fled to Sudan have reported the shelling of towns and attacks on civilians by ethnically based militia. Some refugees have arrived with wounds from knives and machetes. The reports of ethnically targeted attacks underscore simmering ethnic grievances in the country that have fueled concerns for Ethiopia's stability in recent years. UN officials have described ethnic violence in the country as having reached an alarming level over the past 2 years. They've noted that the stigmatization of certain ethnic groups, including the Tigrayans, Amhara, Somali, and Oromo peoples, among others, has significantly contributed to ethnic intolerance in the country. Human Rights Watch has noted the proliferation of official and unofficial armed groups operating with limited oversight and competing narratives of historic injustices among the country's ethnic communities. Communal disputes over borderlands have played out across Ethiopia. Some of the violence in Tigray reflects these tensions over territorial disputes. The town of Maikadra, where one of the worst known incidents of mass killing has occurred since the beginning of the conflict in Tigray, is one of those contested areas. It's been administered as part of Tigray since the EPRDF came to power, but many Amhara consider it to be their traditional land. The hostilities in Ethiopia threaten a range of US interests in the country and the broader region. The level of humanitarian need in Ethiopia was already extremely high before the conflict began, with almost 12 million people facing food insecurity in a region that's been struggling with overlapping natural disasters and the impacts of COVID-19. The conflict poses risks not only for Ethiopia's democratic transition, but also potentially neighboring Sudan's. The reported role of Eritrea in the conflict further complicates the situation.
Thank you. Thank you. We will come back to you during the questions. Thank you very much. Our final witness is Susan Stignett.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your leadership on this issue. I'm the director of the Africa programs at U.S. Institute of Peace, although the views expressed here are my own. Political transitions rarely move forward with consistent, one-directional progress. It is normal that there will be resistance to reforms. It is normal that there will be fundamental debates about the nature and shape of the state. And it is expected that the legacy of a system that was based on exclusion and repression over decades requires sustained generational efforts to forge justice and genuine inclusion. And amidst the escalating tensions that other witnesses have discussed and failed efforts of dialogue, it is deeply concerning, but unsurprising, that Ethiopia's federal government and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front would view the exercise of force as logical, effective, and even necessary in the short term. However, all of our best thinking and practicing knowledge underlines that violence does not work. This knowledge has forged consensus about the imperative of prevention in US policies and assistance, and this approach needs to be at the center of US policy and partnerships with Ethiopia. The reverberations resulting from the violence have exacted intolerable costs: humanitarian, human, economic, food security, and Ethiopia's own regional leadership. And these have provoked core questions about the trajectory of the transition and should provoke a fundamental reassessment of US policy. In this spirit, I'd like to focus my testimony on 4 recommendations for the US administration and the continued leadership from this committee to end and prevent further cycles of violence. First, the US administration and Congress need to continue to send consistent private and public messages about the imperative to de-escalate violence, also to actively discourage outside military engagement and pursue a political solution. The US can and needs to underscore the long-term costs that the conflict will have on Ethiopia's economy and international image. The US can signal and galvanize broader coordinated support with global partners for the African Union's leadership to silence and to keep silent the guns. Second, the US administration and Congress can actively request and provide funding for independent investigation. Allegations of incidents that could amount to war crimes have been reported by all parties. Investigation and documentation are needed to deter further violations, mitigate the risks of escalating rhetoric, and provide a path towards justice and accountability. Preliminary reporting by Amnesty International and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission needs to be bolstered by investigations in other areas where fighting has occurred and with those who have fled the country. Amidst the deep polarization, the competing narratives, and potentially complex jurisdictional issues, the UN High Commission for Human Rights and other UN mechanisms are needed to bolster the existing efforts. Third, the US government can safeguard space for inclusive conversations about the transition. In public and private messaging, the US needs to strengthen its messages in support for freedom of expression, space for independent journalism, and the need to expand conversations to those who have diverging views. Existing assistance programs in support of the transition and democratic development can be activated to support conversations about what inclusion means and ways that confidence can be built towards dialogue. Structures and mechanisms for inclusive conversations are needed to safeguard the broader democratic transition and to prevent backsliding. Conducting credible elections will eventually depend on fostering security, trust, and reconciliation. Ethiopians will need to feel confident that engaging in political debate and campaigning is possible. And eventually, agreeing on changes to the federal structure will require sensitive discussions and negotiations. Setting a precedent that such changes will be done through dialogue and not imposed will be critical. Finally, the US can and needs to engage Ethiopia in the context of a new political and diplomatic strategy for the Red Sea arena that puts inclusive, legitimate governance at the center. A recent bipartisan senior study group convened by USIP determined that in recent years, the geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics of the Horn are increasingly tied to the Middle East. And yet, the US policy has not kept pace with these changes. To overcome the bureaucratic seams, there's a need to designate a special envoy with responsibility or the deputy secretary to bridge between the Horn of Africa and the Middle East. There's a need to realign US assistance to promote inclusive, legitimate governance and economic growth, possibly by designating the Horn of Africa as a priority region under the Global Fragility Act. And there's a need for sustained active congressional engagement to strengthen the coordination between congressional bodies on a trans-regional and interdisciplinary basis, and to encourage bipartisan congressional champions to provide particular support to the transitions in the Horn.
Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of our witnesses for taking time to be with us today. And also, as we navigate this COVID virtual environment, we're used to having hearings in person. And so this is a bit challenging. I now want to go to questions. I will recognize each member for 5 minutes. I will start with myself, then go to ranking member, and we'll go back and forth, Democrat, Republican. I'd like to ask our witness that just finished testifying. You were talking about the relationship of the Horn and the Middle East, and I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little more, referencing specific countries and what aspects of the relationship were you referring to. After that, I'd like to ask Mr. Bakwaza if he would talk about what are some of the minimum preconditions that have to be met for a genuine national dialogue that could lead to an effective political settlement. I'd also like to ask Mr. Bakwaza if he would comment about the U.S. response so far, which has been to suspend aid. And oftentimes that, well, not oftentimes, but when this administration suspending aid might be a tactic that is used, but I'm just not sure whether that helps move the country toward peace. So would you please begin? Ms. Stigman.
Thank you for that question. I think if we look at the recent transition that took place in Sudan, it helps to point to the way where it's critical to involve Gulf countries. If we look back to the Ethiopia-Eritrea peace agreement and the role that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia played in helping to convene and move forward that peace agreement, I think it points to the ways that the Gulf countries have a vested and strong interest going forward. There have been some reports and rumors that there might be some level of involvement of the UAE, given its close relationship with Eritrea. I think that, along with the investigations that have been raised, probably needs some further understanding and information and documentation. And I think there's also an opportunity, not just in terms of potentially dangerous actions, but the ability of key partners to Ethiopia, including the Emiratis, to deliver similar messages to what the United States is delivering. That violence is not a sustainable path forward, that the stability and the integrity of the country is critical, and to use some of their diplomatic and financial and technical partnerships to drive in the same direction forward. And so I think there's an increasing thought that ensuring that we think about the interconnectedness of the economic, political, and security aspects is important. The other piece that I'd mention is that there have been efforts, one of the priorities for the federal government of Ethiopia has been to forge a stronger relationship with Eritrea and Somalia. And if we look at the Red Sea coastline and the strategic positioning of the coastline, this will impact on the overall power dynamics and where the country goes going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagwaza.
Thank you, Chair Bass, for those questions. I think as I was reading earlier, in terms of for an effective dialogue to take place and to move sort of the needle from the political stalemate that Ethiopia has found itself and frankly descended into an armed conflict, there should be a reset of how we understand the entire concept of dialogue in a political context in Ethiopia. Oftentimes it is taken to mean having large gatherings with everyone that has a claim to be a political organization without even necessarily having their status updated or their membership testifying to them. So I think we should be able to clear that with a prior audit so that we can identify which ones are the legitimate representatives of communities and have something to contribute to the political process. I think it should also be based on rules agreed to by all parties, and there should be consequences for those who are not complying with these agreed upon rules. And it should not be facilitated by one of the parties, one of the contending parties. There should be an agreed upon independent facilitator of this dialogue process.
Excuse me, let me ask you, when you say independent in what way? Outside of the country, international, or how can it be internal?
Not necessarily. There have been a number of institutions in Ethiopia that have reasonably wide respect and acceptance among the population. This could be from religious groups, interreligious groups. This could be from thought leaders in academia, where a reasonable agreement by all parties could be reached. Or if that is necessary, and for, I think, mainly professional reasons and providing technical support, there should also be a room for international facilitators. So it should be, it is the perception from the beginning, parties going into with this bias, that this is going to be dominated by a certain group of actors that dooms a lot of these efforts at dialogue so far. So there should be confidence on the facilitators. There should be confidence that there is consequences, and there should be rules that guide that. And I think dialogue in a type of environment that is where the political space is gradually shrinking is not going to give us the results that we aspire. There should be some gesture of releasing all people that are in prison because of the political views that they have espoused. These include journalists, political leaders, and other dissidents. So there should be a broader approach and a systematic approach to what we have done, dialogue in Ethiopia so far, for it to be effective.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let me now turn to Ranking Member Smith for his questions. After all of the members have asked questions for 5 minutes, we'll do another round if members would like that.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Blanchard, in your testimony, you point out that the TPLF denies initiating the conflict on November 4th, accusing Abiy of starting the war to consolidate his personal power. Could you, and I have a number of questions and I want to stay within the time limit. Is there any doubt that the TPLF was involved with going after munitions and going after the military in Tigray, number one? Secondly, you also point out, as maybe a precursor of some of this, that the federal government's decision in October to reshuffle the leadership of the military Northern Command exacerbated the tensions. You might want to speak to that in connection with that first question. In terms of dialogue, and you've all made very good, passionate pleas for meaningful dialogue, and hopefully under some auspices, maybe the UN is the best. But there are 3 envoys, including Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who have been deployed to try to find a way of getting all parties to speak. Would the African Union be, the right institution to initiate this? What are those 3 envoys doing, in order to encourage national dialogue and to deconflict this problem? The safety of humanitarian workers. We know that reports were there were about 4 people who were killed in refugee settings. They were helping Eritreans, but they were killed. We don't know the details. I've looked for them online and elsewhere. Don't know it. Maybe you know it. But what about the safety of humanitarian workers? We know in so many conflict areas they get targeted, and unfortunately, they often get killed. And that is a very, very serious protection that needs to be in place. With regards to the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation of 2009, both Karen Bass and I noted that in HRES 128 as being, an instrument that was so expansive, particularly as it relates to groups like journalists. But we know now that there's a new anti-terrorism law of 2009. It seems to have some wide open language about punishing those who incite terrorism. I'm not sure what the definition is, but again, laws need to be well defined, or else they could be easily breached and bad things can happen. I got a lot of other questions, but that would be in my time. Please try to answer those.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. You've asked me a complicated question. The government's narrative, the federal government's narrative, is that the TPLF attacked facilities in Northern Command and killed soldiers and seized weapons. The TPLF debates that narrative, and it's very difficult to, ascertain who is right and wrong on this. What we do know is that there was a lot of saber rattling and there were tensions that built up to this. And I want to go back to the postponement of elections and the decision by the Tigray government to go ahead and have their own elections. And basically what that resulted in was both sides declaring the other illegitimate. The government in Tigray saying that the government in Addis, the federal government, didn't have the constitutional mandate to extend its own term and needed to have elections before its term expired in October. And then by the same token, the federal government declaring that the elections that Tigray went ahead and held for regional positions were illegitimate. And so after that, when the federal government tried to change out some of the leadership of the Northern Command, which by most accounts is sort of one of the most heavily armed commands in the country, as a legacy of the long border war and standoff with Eritrea. TPLF sort of considered that to be a threat. There were reports by the TPLF before the conflict started on November 4th of troop movements toward the border with Tigray. And so by some accounts, the TPLF felt that it was going to be attacked and moved to respond in self-defense. So the narratives are competed, and CRS certainly isn't in a position to verify which is the correct story. The unfortunate aftermath is that you have a split within the military and security forces in Tigray and elsewhere. There are reports that there's been some isolated fighting among forces, Ethiopian military forces, including in Somalia. One of the things I was going to mention, I ran out of time. Ethiopia is reported to have pulled back at least 3,000, if not more, of their forces from Somalia. They're fighting al-Shabaab and supporting regional stabilization operations. And there are reports of tensions within the forces. So that is, I think something else of U.S. concern. On the issue of the envoys, President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who is the current AU chairman, appointed these three former leaders to serve as envoys. The federal government in Addis has resisted the idea of mediation, of a negotiation with the TPLF, but those envoys did visit and held meetings in Addis Ababa. I don't think they were able to meet with the TPLF, and I don't know what the status of their engagement is. And there are a lot of, I think, suggestions out there on how to move forward on a discussion that de-escalates the conflict from here.
Thank you very much. Let me move now to Susan Wiles.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. And thank you for conducting this hearing. My first question is to Mr. Badwaza. Last year, and on November 28th, the Ethiopian Prime Minister declared victory over the Tigray People's Liberation Front and the end of the military operation in the Tigray region. Since then, however, reports of ongoing violence and unrest have continued. What, in your estimation, is the actual current state of the conflict with the People's Liberation Front? That's my first question, and then I have two sub-questions to that. Mr. Badwaza?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Sure.
As you mentioned, once the federal government declared the cessation of military operations on Saturday, there have been rocket launches to Eritrea. So that is, I think, an indication of the fact that there is still a TPLF force with the capability to engage some sort of military engagement. On top of that, there have been daily reports from outlets that are affiliated with the TPLF talking about downing fighter jets and taking prisoners of war that belong to the Eritrean army. So if the TPLF leadership is fleeing, there is reasonable assessment, and there is reason to believe that at least some of their forces are fighting in some form or another. So again, I would reiterate that it's still difficult to come up with any independent confirmation of what is going on in the region. But I am of the opinion that the fighting has not yet completely stopped.
Do you have any thoughts on immediate steps that could or should be taken by the United States to avert even greater loss of human life, a major humanitarian crisis and a major refugee crisis in the region?
I think that they have opportunities and some gestures by the federal government that are being taken. One of them being the agreement that they reached with the UN to supply humanitarian assistance. And I think that should be complemented by reiterating the call for, since the government has already declared that armed hostilities have stopped, next step should be the start of how to engage in peacemaking. So I think these are opportunities for the United States to call for a continuation of dialogue and engagement, particularly giving a chance to the initiative by the African Union, which the current chair, President Ramaphosa, has started.
And do you have any thoughts on a longer range or what the United States should do on a longer range basis to encourage a political resolution to this conflict?
I think one of it starts with getting the messaging right. I think there should be a consistent, coherent, balanced, and principled messaging from the United States concerning all actors in Ethiopia. So that, for example, the perception that Ethiopians have towards the United States stand with regard to the Nile, the Great Renaissance Dam negotiations has to be rectified in terms of enhancing the U.S. standing among the Ethiopian population, so that any efforts that the United States government would be a part of could be accepted by the Ethiopian population and have the desired effect. So apart from getting a consistent messaging all across the branches of the United States government, there needs to be a very thoughtful and deliberate approach to reaching the communities from both sides, but the Ethiopian population in general directly, because that is one of the challenges we are looking at in terms of all parties taking a piece of that messaging and trying to use to further their stance. So there should be a way of reaching the messaging to the Ethiopian population as well as Ethiopia's other development partners, including the African Union.
Thank you. Let me now move to Representative Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and greetings to today's witnesses, and a special welcome to my friends among the Ethiopian diaspora in my home state of Minnesota, who are surely watching today's hearing with both great interest and equally grave concerns. And I want to reiterate the sentiments of Chairwoman Bass, of Chairman Engel, and Ranking Member McCall, in that Ethiopia is a key ally of the United States of America, and we must continue our important work of preserving the democratic gains, the spurring of economic growth, and advancing peace and security for all. With that said, I remain extremely concerned, gravely concerned by the fighting in Tigray and the risk of internationalization of the conflict and the humanitarian impacts of the conflict as well. I want to focus on human rights for my first question. UN officials are saying that ethnic violence has reached, quote, an alarming level over the past 2 years, and note that the stigmatization of certain ethnic groups, including the Tigray, Amhara, Somali, and Oromo, among others, has significantly contributed to ethnic intolerance throughout the country. Recently, Amnesty International, as well as other NGOs, have reported a major uptick in ethnic and religious violence during the conflict, of which we are all aware. So my first question is a very fundamental one. What should and can Ethiopia be doing to better protect civilians from ethnic and religious-based violence? Perhaps we can start with you, Mr. Bodwaza.
Actually, before you respond, Representative Phillips, I think your screen is blocked, or we're not sure what's happening with your screen. Go ahead, Mr. Bodwaza.
Is that on now?
No, but you can, don't worry about it if you can't get it on. Okay.
Thank you for those questions. I think the escalation of the ethnic violence, intercommunal violence in Ethiopia can be attributed in part to how wrongly the transition that started in 2018 has been managed so far. One of the outcomes of this transition and the liberalization of the political space over the past 2.5 years in Ethiopia is that the emboldenment of these local and regional actors, and some with ethno-nationalist sentiments, to use even government resources to organize and train ethnic-based militias and special forces, and using those to settle political and territorial scores. There have not been any constitutional foundations to some of these armed groups that every state in Ethiopia now seems to have, the militias. And then those, even by the government's own admission, are being actively used to fuel and carry out some of these very violent intercommunal clashes. So I think for a resolution to be found in that regard and to return the political transition back to track, there should be, I think, a serious measure that the federal government should be taking, either to regulate this armed militia and special forces that every region seems to have, and also put a political and legal framework that regulates political organization in Ethiopia, that is in terms of regulating using ethnic and religious affiliation as a political organizing form. So with these measures and getting the legal and political framework and the regulatory framework right, I think there could be some relief, at least when it comes to the various atrocities that the country has witnessed over the past 2.5 years.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I'm so sorry about my video. Apologize for that. I'd like to ask if I can continue questioning, Madam Chair. I would like to ask a question about the elections, of course. As you all know, Ethiopia's election board announced in March 2020 that national and regional elections scheduled for August would be postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Tigray regional government, led by the TPLF, of course, went ahead with its regional council elections in September, despite the federal government warning that the vote, of course, would be illegal. The only while also ensuring that Ethiopia is able to safely hold free and fair elections next year.
Thank you for your question. But part of the reason that the National Election Board postponed the elections was that in March they made a determination that they wouldn't have been able to put in place the necessary technical pieces in the roadmap. And so I think an important foundation point is to have a clear calendar that's regularly updated. And my understanding is that there are ongoing and existing programming to support this aspect of Ethiopia's democratic transition. I think it's important to protect those programs, despite some of the restrictions and holds that were put on assistance in relation to the policies in the talks on the dam and the GERD. But elections aren't just technical exercises. As you well know, they are fundamentally political exercises. And they are moments where, rather than a country most likely coming together, they can be deeply polarizing. And so I think as important as the technical preparations are ensuring that, going back to your first question, that there is a space in the country for civic actors, for people who have different plural voices to be speaking freely their minds, that there is space for journalists to be covering, that there's space for political debate about fundamental questions about where the country heads. And the US can support that through its programming, it can support it through its ongoing messaging. And I think it's very important that there isn't a rush towards elections, that really finding an environment that is ripe is critical to avoid the potential to catalyze additional violence leading into that political milestone.
All right, thank you.
And thank you, Representative Phillips. I certainly remember the visit to your district and the very brief meeting we had with diaspora in your area, and I'm sure your questions reflect their concerns as well. I did want to continue, though, with Ms. Stignant for another minute, especially talking about elections and wanting to know what you think the U.S. might be able to do in terms of supporting Ethiopia getting to the point where they can have the national elections.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think if we look to the experiences in other countries coming out of transition, creating space for the interpolitical dialogue that needs to take place is a priority. And so my understanding is that there are existing programs through democracy assistance that are working to support political parties, that are working to support civic groups. I think that's going to need additional attention. We often approach elections and peace building as separated cones. And I think there's a particular need coming out of this violence and what we see as the closing space to interconnect these together more effectively. There will be, I think, a tendency for political leaders to mobilize their base and finding ways to ensure that remains nonviolent if people are coming to the streets will be absolutely critical going into the electoral period.
Well, and it is an area where we have had a lot of cuts in terms of governance and democracy and governance. Those two categories have had significant budget cuts. And so I think looking at a new administration coming in, I wanted to ask Mr. Badwaza and also Ms. Blanchard, what advice do you have for the new administration? And then can you specifically comment on the impact that cutting foreign assistance has already had? So I would ask both Mr. Badwaza and Ms. Blanchard to respond to that. And then I will go to Mr. Smith for any concluding questions that he has. Badwaza?
Thank you, Chair Bass, again. I think, again, there is a lot of support by way of humanitarian assistance that goes to Ethiopia from the United States. And over the years, the core principles that used to guide the relationship has been this cooperation over counterterrorism efforts in the region. That has, in the years past, I think, clouded some of the real human rights and political concerns that the Ethiopian population was having. And messaging, again, from the United States was not really to the satisfaction of a large majority of the Ethiopian population. As it has been mentioned earlier, there have been resolutions that needed to come out of the US House of Representatives to highlight those concerns and to sort of chart a direction to a more democratic political process in Ethiopia. So I would say the incoming new administration should be proactive in engaging voices outside of the government. I understand government-to-government relations should continue, but in terms of getting a wider perspective of the developments and the core national issues on Ethiopia, I think there should be a focus on institution building. For example, there have been really encouraging work that is being done, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission over the past few months in terms of investigating human rights abuses over all over the country, and also trying to hold officials to account to their deeds. So I think the United States should focus on encouraging institutions like this one and building independent media, which could foster the culture of inclusive dialogue and independent analysis of events instead of the one we are seeing based mainly on hateful practices, hate speech, and dangerous speech that is being particularly in many cases produced by members of the diaspora and being imported to the conversation in the domestic political spheres. I think there are measures that need to be taken in terms of trying to tame the impact of these harmful interventions from actors both inside and outside of Ethiopia, and the United States government can support independent groups, independent institutions, including the media, to try and counter those harmful narratives and foster the culture of inclusive political dialogue.
Thank you. Ms. Blanchard, if you could quickly respond, because I've actually run out of time.
Sure, absolutely. You asked about the U.S. assistance and how it's changed. And of course, democracy and governance funding and programming in Ethiopia prior to the transition when Abiy came into office was limited in large part because of the restricted political space in the country. It's since expanded, particularly with the aim of supporting democratic elections. But that assistance has been impacted by the suspension related to the GERD negotiations. As you know, in August, the administration suspended roughly $260 million in assistance to Ethiopia. Of that total of 260 million, at least 30 million has been redirected elsewhere. It was expiring. And of what remains, by my tally, over $20 million in governance and democracy and human rights related funding is affected. Now, how much of an effect is a little bit difficult to tell because a lot of that programming was also somewhat slowed by the COVID pandemic and partners' ability to program in the midst of that. And of course, the election delay also had some impact. But I think there are concerns that the suspension of assistance may have an impact on the U.S. and partners' ability to respond to the conflict. With the prospect of elections coming up, there is so much work to do if they are to be held, voter registration exercises and otherwise. And of course, these outstanding questions about whether or not the conflict continues, that will impact the ability to hold elections in Tigray. But potentially in other parts of the country, this was part of what had delayed the election processes, including a planned census was the large amount of displacement from conflict in the years preceding.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, would you like to close us out with a round of 5 minutes?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. A couple of questions on the anti-terrorism law of 2019. Does it comport with human rights norms? Did it truly replace the proclamation of 2009, which we were very, very critical of? The safety of humanitarian personnel, we didn't have time to get an answer to that. Do you feel that there will be enough assurances there? Mr. Badwaza, you had talked in your testimony about an audit of political actors, and I'm not sure what you meant. Is that for accountability, or is that to include them in a dialogue? Maybe you could just amplify or give some clarity as to what that audit would look like. And Ms. Dale Lema, in your November 11th op-ed in the New York Times, you claim that much of the blame for the Tigray conflict lies with Prime Minister Abiy. One of the pieces of evidence that you cite is that the Prime Minister dismantled the old political order. and marginalized the TPLF through the creation of the Prosperity Party last year, which the TPLF did not want to join. However, we did point out in the op-ed that following massive protests by the Oromo and Ampara communities, which together make up of nearly 2/3 of the population, you point out that these protests were against the TPLF's dominance of the governing TPLF coalition and their authoritarian rule. So I'm just, when you have a true majority, should there be some restructuring of the old political order, which had dominated Ethiopia for so long? And again, as one who's pointed out massive human rights abuses over the years being committed by previous governments. And Don Payne, who was my ranking, and I was his ranking when he was chair, we went back and forth. Like Karen and I have gone back and forth over the years. He too was very critical, in terms of massive human rights abuses. So maybe you could speak to that. And the role of faith-based. Are the faith-based leaders, whether they be in the Islamic community or from the Christian community, are they playing a positive role? Ms. Blanchard?
Sorry, I didn't know if you had directed that at me. Let me start with your last question. The faith-based community in Ethiopia has been trying to engage to stop the fighting. The Inter-Religious Council has called for an immediate end to the fighting and called for dialogue and echoed some of the sentiments that have been expressed by the AU leadership and others in the international community. To your other questions, I would defer to Joseph and Sidale on their thoughts on the revisions to the restrictive legislation. But as you note, there was a major political opening in 2018 and 2019, and that can't be discounted. Thousands of political prisoners released, opposition leaders and groups that had been in exile and accused of treason able to come back into the country, sort of a flourishing of press freedom. But by the same token, I think in the last year and a half or so, there has been some sign of tightening space. And that I think reflects some of the government's struggles in trying to figure out how to manage this simmering ethnic conflict, communal conflicts that are happening around the country. The unrest, excuse me, that broke out in July, in which hundreds of people were killed. I think the government struggled with how to deal with that, but the 3-week shutdown of the internet meant that I think for other voices to stem the violence and stem the disinformation that was spreading was very limited, and that was very difficult. And we're seeing the same with the situation in Tigray now.
Mr. Badwazi and Dalet.
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. I'll take the anti-terrorism proclamation question. I think overall it is a major departure from the 2009 really draconian law. I say this for a couple of reasons. One, the level of effort that the drafting committee made to include different perspectives, including civil society, media professionals, and regional actors was, I think, one of the very encouraging features that distinguishes the new anti-terrorism proclamation from the 2009 one. And in terms of content, secondly, I think the changes it made to the acts that were considered terrorist did, and also the evidentiary provisions that it introduced by rejecting some of the very controversial aspects of the older law. I would say this is a much better, a much better piece of legislation as compared to the 2009 one. The audit I mentioned of political groups is related to, I think, making the dialogue interventions effective. What I'm saying is that there are hundreds of political parties that have registration certificates from the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia. And I think an actual audit would reveal that once the registration criteria have been met by many of these political groupings, it is very questionable whether a lot of them have a functioning constituency that they represent. Yet many of these groups get to a gathering that is named dialogue, and you see a venue full of people talking about different priorities of their own, sometimes individual, sometimes a small group, mixed with political groups that have genuine political agenda, economic plans, and socio-cultural policies to actually transform the lives of people for the better. So my suggestion is to try and sift which ones are really working for the good of the population, and which ones are just representing their own interests, or they wanted to be staying in the political scene without necessarily having a viable policy framework to offer to the Ethiopian people. So that is what I meant by an audit should be conducted.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Badwa. Ms. Lima?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. You have asked a very legitimate question, and we all know what led to the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's ascent to office is that there was a very, almost after the 2015 election, the first thing that happened was rejection of the result of that election, in which the EPRDF won more than 99% of the seats. So there was that very legitimate rejection. It has lost its legitimacy. It has grown into a chronic, a collection of some, crony members of the elite, the top elite. So the Ethiopian people detested EPRDF. And as such, there was a legitimate need to dismantle it. It is not the question of dismantling it. It is the question of how it was dismantled that created no avenue for these parties to come and have a dialogue to sort their differences, because the EPRDF was the last, so to say, umbilical cord that kept these parties together for all their differences. It somehow provided them the space to come and talk if they could manage to settle their differences there. With that dismantlement, it wasn't only, the question became not only not having the space to discuss, but also a question of power. Because when you dismantle it, you pushed away the people who held it together and who monopolized it. This is one point. The second one is, for 27 years, the country did not have any other political order except for the EPRDF. So when you dismantle that, you are unleashing a political force without having an alternative that could absorb the shock that would come as a result of dismantling. So as I said, it was like hitting it with a blunt force. It needed an unraveling that should have been carefully done. And that is why I'm holding the Prime Minister responsible for dismantling it unceremoniously and for creating that power vacuum in which disgruntled members of the EPRDF could come back and demand a seat at the table, because that it's not only the lack of the avenue for discussion, but also the power question. And that is what is leading the multiple crises in the country. It also led to have no political viable force in the southern nations, where in the southern nations and nationalities, when the regional state was undergoing through an increasing number of questions for self-administration. The dismantlement of the SEPDM in the southern nation has led to the vacuum of a mediating force between these rising questions for self-administration and the central government. So these self-administration questions have led to multiple violences that we have seen in the last 2.5 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Phillips. You are there.
We'll try this again. Thank you. Sorry for my AV problems. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Lema, I'd like to continue with you relative to the free press. The Ethiopian federal government, of course, has cut phone service and internet communications with the Tigray region and restricted journalists' access, making it awfully difficult for the outside world to verify any information that we are hearing. Of course, we're all seeing continued reports of detention of political opponents, and it's deeply troublesome. So please, very specifically, what can the United States do to ensure access of the press and due process in Ethiopia during these trying times?
And Ms. Lema, I'm going to ask, because we actually are over time for the hearing. So if you could respond quickly, and then we will wrap up the hearing.
Thank you very much. It's not too late for the government to allow independent journalists to travel to the area. However, to find out what exactly happened in the last 1 month, it would be even too overwhelming for even powerful media, independent media, to establish. And without establishing what exactly happened in the last 1 month, it would be very difficult to solve the problem. Going forward, it remains very crucial that communication is restored, and that Tigrayans that are living outside of the region have the right to find out what exactly happened to their family, not only for journalists, access to journalists, but they have the right to find out whether their families are dead or alive. So the restoration of communication as soon as possible is immediate. And the United States can do that by having a conversation with the federal government, opening up all communication, allowing journalists to travel to the area, those who can't travel to the area, and continue filing the reports from the ground and talking to other people. This remains very crucial, and it cannot wait a day.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm grateful to you, and thank you for your time today. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Absolutely. Well, let me thank the ranking member, Mr. Smith, and the other members who attended, and especially all of our witnesses. Thank you so much. We know this is such a crucial time in Ethiopia and in the entire region in East Africa. And in about 50 or so days, we will have a new administration coming in, which I think it's going to take some time for the new administration to get settled and functional, and for all of the top officials to be confirmed. But I think that we need to look forward to see what can the U.S. do, what kind of assistance can we provide. Clearly, we need to make sure that the accounts for governance and democracy are well funded, and so that we can participate in whatever way possible in helping to bring peace to Ethiopia. Thank you very much, and I call the meeting adjourned.
Daramutani duga fannisu ijafon argaa yoomuun callisu hawwadii gaddu lakkii Oromoo tokkummaan hobaddu qomo har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Bara dabraa dhufaanuti wal cabsaa. Eenyuma keenyarra waraana labsaa nama gantuutu qabsootu muratabsaa ilma gantuutu qabsootu muratabsaa sirnaalee taasifamuu jibbu warraa hin beekne qaboo firbu kayyoo fageega qabsaa'oota dabsitu seenaatu si gaafata kayyoo fageega qabsaa'oota dabsitu seenaatu si gaafata. Oromoo sana gadaati gadaan keenya gaaddisa addunyaati Oromoon tokko ilmaan abbaati namuun simannoo sana jibbaati. Argee boosoo siifin bitamtu laga bootoo siifin bitamtu arsii deemtuu siifin bitamtu turma dhuftuu siifin bitamtu abadaayituu siifin bitamtu tooraayituu siifin bitamtu baddee bootoo siifin bitamtu machaaraan xiyyaa siifin bitamtu wallagee fayyaa siifin bitamtu beekiin xiyyaa siifin bitamtu baalee xiyyaa siifin bitamtu siifin bitamtu siifin bitamtu siifin bitamtu siifin bitamtu siifin bitamtu. Daramutani duga fannisu ijafon argaa yoomuun callisu hawwadii gaddu lakkii Oromoo tokkummaan hobaddu qomo har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Ni kalee kutaana danuu kootee. Arras nurraa nafnee bari'aa kootee arras nurraa nafnee bari'aa kootee arras nurraa nafnee bari'aa kootee nuti Oromoon hin daynu ganda hirrisaas miti hin taanu banda saba gootummaan alagaa iddoo adda fukkuttee yoomiyyuu bittu saba gootummaan alagaa iddoo adda fukkuttee yoomiyyuu bittu. Barkuumee leenca marreessaa nu keessa jirta ilma hundeessaa Oromoon sanyii taatasaa birruu dhibaaf nagumaa dhaloonni jirroo kajirroo. Harargee bootoo siifin bitamtu wallagga deemtuu siifin bitamtu arsii deemtuu siifin bitamtu Boorana deemtuu siifin bitamtu Gujiin xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Awwadaa gootaa siifin bitamtu Wachaaraan gootaa siifin bitamtu Galamsuu gootaa siifin bitamtu Finfinneen xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Asallaan xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Jimma xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Iluu xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Harargeen xiyyaa siifin bitamtu. Siifin bitamtu. Seenaatu si gaafata kayyoo fageega qabsaa'oota dabsitu seenaatu si gaafata. Oromoo sana gadaati gadaan keenya gaaddisa addunyaati Oromoon tokko ilmaan abbaati namuusi mannuu sana jibbaati 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 Arargee bootu siifin bitamtu Wallagga bootu siifin bitamtu Arsii deemtu siifin bitamtu Turamadu siifin bitamtu Awwadaa deemtu siifin bitamtu Torooraadhaitu siifin bitamtu Waldeeyyee bootu siifin bitamtu Machaaraan xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Wallaggee xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Beekkiin xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Baalee xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Siifin bitamtu Siifin bitamtu Siifin bitamtu Siifin bitamtu
Dajane yoona dhageesse dhaga'aan jiru. Si dhaga'aan jiru yoona dhageesse. Dajane yoona dhageesse si dhaga'aan jiru gaaffii kee maan dhageenya karaa keetiin.
Dharambootani dhugaa fannisu ija foon argaa yommuun callisu awwalii galuu lakkii Oromoo tokkummaan humnaa hubadhufamu har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Har'as qabsoon sabaan keenya galma yeroo murteessitu jira amma. Arras nurrahan afne bariyakote Arras nurrahan afne bariyakote Nuti Oromoon hindaynu ganda Kirrisas mitiin taanu banda Saba gootummaan alagaa iddoo
Sirban alagaa garuu sagalee kenna ga'u.
Saba gootummaan alagaa iddoo Adda bukkuttee yoomiyyuun bittu. Barkumee leenca marreessaa nu keessa jirtaa ilma hundeessaa Oromoon sanyii taaddasaa birruu dhibaaf nagumaa dhaloonni jirroo kajirroo kajirroo kajirroo. Arargee bootu siifin bitamtu Wallagga deemtu siifin bitamtu Arsii deemtu siifin bitamtu Boorana deemtu siifin bitamtu Gujiin xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Awwadaa gootaa siifin bitamtu Machaaraan gootaa siifin bitamtu Galamsoo gootaa siifin bitamtu Finfinneen xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Asallaan xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Jimma xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Iluu xiyyaa siifin bitamtu Arargeen xiyyaa siifin bitamtu. Siifin bitamtu. Bara dabraa dhufaa nuti wal cabsaa keenyumaa keenyarra waraana labsaa nama gantuutu qabsootu murattabsaa ilma gantuutu qabsootu murattabsaa kennaalee taasifummaa jibbu warraa hin beekne qabuu firbu kayyoo fakee gaggabsaa ootaa dabsitu seenaatu si gaafata kayyoo fakee gaggabsaa ootaa dabsitu seenaatu si gaafata.
Oromiyaan lafumaa Oromummaan nafumaa yaaduma qawweetumuu dhumi jaanin dhumuu. Waan qabu waliin qabaa waan dhabu waliin dhabaa kana yaantummaa qabu hin eeginaa hin cabuu. Barak, barak, barak. Gaafa guulaa nu guulchisa, gaafa duulaa nu duulchisa. Waan galgala abbaa eeggatu, yoo beekkatan guyyaan beekkatu. Goonni diinaan girree bu'aa, gaafa xiiqii sabaa bu'aa. Gaafa roorroo ilmi dhiiraa, gaafa xiiqii ilmi dhiiraa. Biyyaara qabsoo keenya hayyootatu bararse, beensilli isaa dhiigaa gongubee lafeetti cabse. Mul'is gadaa Mustafaa Harawee, qabsoo sirbaa fi dhukaasa qawwee. Eebbisaafus maayyoo hirmiin ba'ame, bakka laaf jireenyaa iyyaan dhabame.